Good evening. I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's conversation. We're going to have an essential conversation this evening, one of the most important the Center for Free Expression has hosted in the past 9 years. It's titled Finding a Way Forward for Jews and Palestinians in This Terrible Time. Before we begin, however, I want to acknowledge that the land on which I am speaking to you this evening is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I also want to thank the co-sponsors for tonight's conversation, the In Spirit Foundation, the Edmonton Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, the Vancouver Public Library, and PEN Canada. We're grateful to all of you for your co-sponsorship. The horror of what happened on October 7th and since almost defies description. The level of death, injury, and suffering, of grief and trauma is virtually impossible to comprehend. It must end. But before there can be any kind of stable coexistence of people in Israel and Palestine, there will have to be a stable coexistence of narratives. Raja Khouri and Jeffrey Wilkinson, our featured guests this evening, whom I'm going to introduce in a moment, have written a new book which addresses this and much more. It is titled The Wall Between: What Jews and Palestinians Don't Want to Know About Each Other. This is a copy of the book. It was published on October 3rd of 2023 and is now in its third printing, and I'd strongly encourage you to read it. Let me introduce our participants. Raja Khouri is CEO of Khouri Conversations. He is founding president of the Canadian Arab Institute, former senior fellow with the Wellesley Institute. He spent 10 years as a commissioner with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He is Canada Committee member of Human Rights Watch and co-founder of the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group. Welcome, Raja.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Jeffrey Wilkinson is an American Jew who lives in Canada. He holds a doctorate in education from the University of Toronto and works actively in the Jewish community and beyond on issues relating to trauma and the Israel-Palestine struggle. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Jim. Glad to be here.
Raja and Jeff are going to be in conversation with Mira Sucharov. Mira is professor of political science at Carleton University, and she specializes in international relations and the politics of Israel-Palestine. Welcome, Mira.
Thank you.
The format for tonight's event is there's going to be a conversation for the next 45 to 55 minutes with Jeffrey and Raja and Mira. Following that, we're going to turn to questions from the audience. If you look at your screen in front of you, you'll see at the bottom of it a Q&A button. So at any time, as you're listening to Jeff and Raja and Mira, a question comes to mind that you'd like to ask one of them or the group of them, please just click on that Q&A button and write out your question. And when we get to the point where we turn to the audience, Mira will ask Ansh Holmes, the coordinator for the center, to read out the first question. And then the group will deal with that question, go on to the next one. So please take advantage of this opportunity to raise questions that you may have with one or the other or any of the three of our guests. But do it as you listen to the conversation. Don't wait till we turn to the audience so we can get through as many questions as possible. That's all for me. So over to you. Looking forward to your conversation.
Thanks, Jim. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, even though I've talked to both of you extensively for years about this kind of work, but our audience hasn't necessarily had the opportunity to do that. So tell us a little bit about yourself beyond credentials and all that stuff, which is really important, but just who are you and what brought you to this work? Let me start with Jeff.
Okay, well, this is the quintessential question, who are we? And I think usually in this work, we first identify with our tribe. And I'm going to identify as a human who cares deeply about how suffering keeps us apart, who cares about life, dignity, and respect, who is, I'm committed to limiting or erasing boundaries between humanities caused by tribal affiliation, fear, guilt. And I am a partner of a Palestinian who I have learned to deeply respect, love, and care for because of our shared dedications and values and commitments.
Were you by any chance talking about me?
Raja, who are you and what brought you to this work?
I'm someone who doesn't accept that's the way things are as a reason for not doing anything. I'm also someone who deeply believes in justice and in humanity. So I'm of a Palestinian origin. I was born in Lebanon. My parents left Palestine in 1948 and could not go back. And the issue of Palestine is something that was part of my life since I was a child. I remember the 1967 war vividly, even though I was only 8 years old. I remember my dad's face 6 days into the war, and the tears on his face, having just realized that Palestine was lost forever. So the issue of Palestine has always been part of my life, an important part of my life, and I've advocated for Palestinian rights for a long time. I've worked in human rights, and that was a forum in which I was able to interact with Jewish colleagues, and beginning to realize that I had things in common with them, even though they were Zionist, and even though they were defenders of Israel. But I found things in common with them. I heard things I hadn't heard before, such as Zionism to them is an act of self-determination and having a safe home for Jews, which is, very different from the Zionism that I was familiar with, a destructive force, the responsible for the destruction of Palestinian society and giving basically to Jews everything they gave to Jews took away from Palestinians. So and that's when I started wondering, what else don't I know? And I wanted to know more and started a dialogue process that's taken now 17 years. And being a person who's motivated by justice and human rights, it always bothered me that these two Canadian communities, the Jewish and the Palestinian/Arab one, living side by side, were not only so much at odds with each other, but they actually, distrusted, even at times hated each other, while at the same time knowing very little about the other. And what they knew was driven by propaganda, disinformation, stereotypes. And I thought, what, if this is something I can do something about, influence even a little bit, that will be a good use of my career and life, and that's why I wanted to write this book. And this lovely gentleman, Jeff Wilkinson, walked into my office one day, and he was doing his PhD research, and I was one of his victims. We hit it off immediately, and he will tell you the rest of that story from his perspective. But that's a long answer to your short question.
So, Jeff, how did you know that Raja was the one for you in terms of research partner?
Wow. Well, the key answer to me is his warmth and openness. He opened up to me within seconds about deeply personal issues. He had clearly been able to process and talk about his pain, and at the same time limit to a great extent who to blame for that pain. He was able to have empathy and show care for the Jews that he had spoken with. And he's pretty funny, and he makes really, really good hummus. So that also helped a lot.
Nice. So we're only a few minutes into the show tonight, and we've already gotten into cultural appropriation debates and the food wars. But before we delve into that, I do want to ask, and I want to take people through this wonderful book, which of course you could not have imagined that your initial book launches would be held against the shadow of October 7th and the ensuing Israeli assault on Gaza. So we'll get into some of the details here. Before we do that, I want to know how you think about power in your relationship. Israelis have power over Palestinians. Do Jews have power over, do Jewish Canadians have power over Palestinian Canadians? How do you think about these things together? I'll start with you, Jeff.
Oh, that's a fascinating question, Mira. I am conscious, even in our relationship, of the systemic power I hold and could wield over Raja if I chose to. Which is the reason I work really hard not to. So my community has the ability to sway the conversation in a way that Raja's community does not. My community has the ear of politicians in the way that Raja's community does not. But our relationship is based on mutual respect, not even solely or even sometimes partially on our identities as a Jew and a Palestinian, but our shared values. I think it's been a really, really tough conversation in the last 6 months about power, because I think the general tenor of the volume of conversation out there has moved to become much more pro-Palestinian. And as the months have dragged on, people are more and more engaged and incensed at what they see as, absolutely unforgivable violence. Yet, at the power center, these communities don't have the ability yet to change how things are on the ground. We, often speak with students and teachers and journalists and others who all have their fears, anxieties, pains that they're going through in the last 6 months, but only one group is losing jobs. Only one group is having their schooling and their placements threatened. Only one group is living through this constant threat of losing their livelihood, of their place. And I think that is about power. And I think it's made it really complicated, because even the change in the amount of acceptance of pro-Palestinian speech, I believe has made mainstream Jews feel more threatened, because it is harder to control the narrative, which we've really been able to do with relative ease over the last 75 years. And it's not as easy today.
Raja, how has power come up for you in your collaboration with Jeff?
Well, I'm going to finish his sentence, which is why, the Palestinian story is not as well known as the Jewish story and among the Canadian in the Canadian public sphere. Every Canadian knows about the Holocaust, for instance, but not too many would know about the Nakba, about 1948, and the Palestinian dispossession and loss. Now, that started changing, I think, in the last 10 years or so, when the left and the justice movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Idle No More, reconciliation with indigenous people, created all these justice movements that adopted the Palestinian cause. But when they realized that it's a human rights cause, and it's between an oppressor and an oppressed people. It's interesting that it's taken decades for the world to realize that. And that's because the Jewish narrative, or the Israeli narrative, I should say, was very powerful out there. So between Jeff and I, there is no power imbalance whatsoever. And in fact, we have such a relationship that I joke with him sometimes. I tell him, I forget you're Jewish. You're a regular person to me. You're a close friend, period, regardless of what your background is.
Jeff, how do you take that? Do you like that when Raja says that to you, or do you feel erased?
No, not at all. Not at all. I know exactly where he's coming from. He doesn't forget that I'm Jewish. He just doesn't define me solely as Jewish. He defines me by my values. And I totally like that. I do have to say that he's less accepting of the fact that I'm American than that I'm Jewish.
Yeah, I tell him I forgive him for being Jewish, but not for being American.
Right. Nice. So I want to start unpacking a few things in the book. So a big part of the book is which I think is really helpful, particularly, and I feel very safe reading this book. Maybe we'll talk a bit about safe spaces, and this ties into the Center for Free Expression. I feel very safe reading this book because it's co-authored by a Jew and a Palestinian. And so when you're talking, and you write with a single authorial voice, like we never know who is writing, but we know that we presume both have vetted the text and both stand by the content, right? And so it's not a debate. The book isn't in the form of a debate. And so you take the reader through various ideas and concepts and terms, and you inform the reader how Jews tend to define or experience a particular term or event, and how Palestinians tend to define or experience a particular event. Of course, we know, and I think you know, and I think you nod to this in the beginning, you're doing a parsimonious attempt to talk about the Palestinians as a single group, knowing that there is diversity within Palestinian opinion, and Jews as a single group, knowing that there is diversity within Jewish opinion. And I, for one, as a scholar, find that useful and helpful because there are dominant narratives that define particular groups, even if there are outliers. So let's start with Zionism. Raja, you gave that as an example, that Zionism meant one thing to you, and as you were growing up and hearing about your father's story and experiencing the Palestinian story from looking southward from your home in Lebanon at the time and then later in Canada. So are there two different meanings of Zionism, or is there one meaning that we should all realize is the true definition? How do we deal with this idea that a single word can mean something so different to different people, Raja?
From my experience, I realized that there are many different meanings to Zionism. It's a very individual sentiment and thought and opinion, and I think it's asking someone what does Zionism mean to them is a very good starting point for a constructive sort of conversation discussion, because you can make all kinds of assumptions about people based on that label. I can tell you, to Palestinians, it's a swear word. It's about, if you want to insult someone, you call him a Zionist. But I came to reject that notion. I met a lot of good people who value justice and humanity and human life and human rights, who identify as Zionists. And there are different kinds of Zionists. I can tell you right now that, hardline Zionists and I do not have anything in common, or have very little in common. but people on the progressive side, I found a lot in common with them. It doesn't mean that we agree all the time. You know, it would be very boring if we agreed all the time. You don't learn from people you agree with. But there's enough common ground to have constructive conversations.
Jeff?
Well, you know, over time, I struggle more and more with concepts like progressive or liberal Zionism. Excuse me, for two reasons. First of all, Raja made the first key point, is that we as Jews do a lot of parsing about Zionism. Palestinians do not. Zionism to Palestinians is loss, removal, a domination, oppression, loss of language, loss of space, loss of culture. It has no redemptive qualities. And I think that's the first thing I think we need to understand when we put a label, we say progressive Zionist. To a Palestinian, it's really not that much difference in saying I'm a progressive white supremacist. It really isn't. And I think that we've been really slow to come to that. So I struggle personally with norms of things like progressive Zionism, because I think it has allowed sort of this neoliberal structure of we're good people, we care, you know, kind of links up to the talk about the two-state solution. I don't know if we're going to talk about that tonight or not, but this sort of feeling that we're generously giving something, you know, to a marginalized group, and that they're supposed to be grateful for it. So I kind of struggle with the whole concept. I have mercy. I honestly think that Raja has done more to help me be compassionate to progressive Zionists than Jews have. And I think that's really important because he sees their goodness. He sees their intentions. I struggle to not see that you're not willing to give up something. I mean, if you say you progress and you care about Palestinians, but you're not going to put something on the table for it, I struggle with that.
We also, just to finish that thought, you know, we also see progressive Zionists struggling themselves to make two ends meet that often don't, and that is their conviction that, you know, there should be a Jewish majority state place somewhere where Jews can feel safe, while at the same time, you know, wanting for Palestinians to have justice and self-determination and those things. And they struggle when it comes to the point where, you know, in some cases, the only way to, you know, square that circle is to say, well, we really cannot be insisting on this Jewish majority for too long, because it's not, you know, it's not working. It's not going to work if we want to be, you know, believe in full equality and freedom and rights for everyone. So it's, and when I see them struggling, I feel for them.
So I'm going to ask you a hard question. So hearing that Jeff is not even very comfortable with progressive Zionism, you see it as a contradiction in terms, if I understood you correctly a little bit. Raja has been listening to progressive Zionists sympathetically so that you can create dialogue across communities in your work. It's been very important for you over the decades. In fact, I met you, Raja, years ago back when I was more involved with certain progressive Zionist groups in Toronto. And I said, are you a real Palestinian? And you said, I remember you saying, I'm as Palestinian as they get. So that's another problem that I have. I notice when I meet Palestinian Canadians or Americans, I tend to want to test them to make sure I'm with a real, you know, bona fide, you haven't been a sellout, and that's my own issue. So I've got to look deep there. Why do I do that? But some people might ask, why should we read this book, meaning a book where both authors seem to agree pretty closely? In other words, I'm inviting you to tell us what is the value added, and I know there is. What is the value added of a book where it's a Jew and a Palestinian, and yet you do have a lot of political overlap?
Right. I think the key thing is that we are focused on not who is right, but what is right. that we have overcome our own issues. I mean, I don't want to appear here that I haven't struggled, or that I'm done struggling. I mean, we have conversations where Raja sends me, a short little movie that includes images of people wrapped in keffiyeh around the face, and hollering things and having a machine gun, and I know I'm supposed to take that as an oppressed group resisting their oppression. But sometimes my first reaction is not the right. Well, I don't think it's the right one, but I'm feeling threatened. I remember the first time I really encountered a pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist protest, and I felt unsafe. And that really bothered me, because I knew that I saw myself as an ally, but I didn't feel like an ally. I felt like an outsider. But the beauty of our relationship is I call him immediately and I say, I'm uncomfortable with this. How do we talk about it? This doesn't happen. I'll be fair. It doesn't happen a lot. I mean, we aren't as juicy as a Jew and Palestinian, as maybe some people, would like the salacious. I mean, you have shared with us conversations you've had with a Palestinian colleague that are more fiery, perhaps, than the conversations we have. But it's really because we've been listening and listening and listening for years. And it's not that we never disagree or that we never struggle with something. It's that our focus is we need to work together.
And Raja, how do you feel when Jeff calls you and saying, I'm not sure about this video, and you've gone out on a limb and presented this video to him? So what is that? How do you deal with that?
Well, first thing I tell him is thank you for reaching out to understand this video. And I try to understand, what triggered him, and explain things to the best of my abilities. See, the thing is that we trust each other. Jeff trusts that when I explain something to him, it's an honest opinion. I'm not giving him propaganda. I'm not trying to sway his thinking. I'm giving him as much of an honest opinion as I can. And he knows that, and I know that about him. So the trust is there, and it becomes talking about things and explaining them a lot easier.
I'm going to add, Amira, that I think that we really are in this place where we're expecting perfection. We're expecting purity of every response, that we are taking constant temperature litmus tests of one's loyalties. I felt a little choke in my throat when I admitted that I struggled with that picture, because I know that fits in with the Western trope about terror and Arabs, and I don't want to be a part of that. But if I can't say it, how am I going to undo it? And I think one of our greatest problems right now is we are constantly putting the litmus paper on every single word and deciding that someone is, nope, I don't want to talk to them. They're not part of me. Why? Because we're struggling. How are you going to change if you don't struggle?
So there's a word in here in chapter 6. The title of chapter 6 contains one of those words. Do you remember which chapter I mean? Is there a particular chapter?
Of course.
Questions
Of
about?
course, we remember the chapter.
Because my eyes went right to it, because there is a very either famous or infamous, depending on your view, scholar, a public intellectual, Judith Butler, who used this word to describe October 7th and recently, and has gotten a lot of heat over it. The word is resistance, as in Palestinian resistance. Now, you wrote this book before October 7th. It came out just before October 7th, though, of course, there had been acts of terrorism, which I define as attacks against combatants for attacks against non-combatants for political ends. But October 7th was, of course, the largest act of terrorism in Israel's history. So can you unpack this term for us, Palestinian resistance? How do you think about that term in the context of October 7th? Does it fit? Does it not fit? How does it work with litmus tests? Tell us a little bit about what you wrote about Palestinian resistance in this chapter. And finally, 3-part question, but I'll remind you if you forget it. How has October 7th affected your work? together. So, Raja.
Okay, so I hadn't realized how threatened Jews feel by not just Palestinian resistance, but by using the words Palestinian resistance. And it was a wake-up call for me, and I learned that from Jeff. And then I realized that even saying Palestine can trigger a Jewish person, let alone free Palestine. I mean, it's we have kids in school, Jewish kids, seeing someone with a T-shirt that says "Free Palestine" and feeling unsafe and going home and saying, this and that, and it creates a problem for the school. And that's the sad part. That's why we wrote this book, to give room for people who are, as Jeff says, they want to know more, to understand the other better, so that there's, looking for common ground. This book is meant for them, to help them sort of make that step forward in that direction. But I mean, Palestinian resistance, the importance of talking about Palestinian resistance is that the West has not spoken about Palestinian resistance as a resistance movement against occupation or oppression. It describes it as terrorism. For decades, as long as I can remember, any violence perpetrated by Palestinians was called terrorism. If that doesn't discredit you enough, then it becomes anti-Semitism. And these two terms have been used over and over again to silence Palestinians. And to Western audiences, that worked. It worked for the longest time. And one of the reasons things are changing now is because we have social media. Despite its many detractions, social media has democratized information and given access to people who, I just saw a video clip that came from Gaza this afternoon, shot by a Gazan citizen who was there when the bomb exploded and started taking a video clip, a video of it. So, it's important to remind Westerners in particular. We forget that Palestinians live under occupation. I mean, how long can you live under occupation without resisting? It's been 57 years now, almost. And every time Palestinians resist in violent means, it's called terrorism. So it's important, and the West people, especially people on the left, are beginning to realize that Palestinians are resisting an oppression, and the idea of resistance is becoming acceptable and is not equal to terrorism anymore to many people.
Jeff?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this issue. The first one, I'll as we've already shared with you, we don't use the word terrorism. We see it as a militant action against a civilian that is wrong. It's a war crime. The only reason I'll only speak for me. The reason I don't use the word terrorism is because I think it gets misused, not because some acts aren't terror or create terror. From a social psychological point of view, that terror is that completely uncontrollable fear of something of harm that you can't do anything to resist. And so I have deep empathy for the feeling of terror, but I am concerned about the misuse of the word. We said on the evening of October 7th, the two of us together released a statement, said that we deplore and absolutely we do condemn all violence against civilians, against non-combatants. We've had trouble with the litmus test of just about everyone engaged, particularly Palestinians. The first question they're asked is, do you condemn Hamas? And I think the biggest learning I've had, the biggest learning curve I've had in the last 5 to 6 years is to see that for a Palestinian, to exist is to resist. And to resist is to exist. This is a paradigm that is locked into the zeitgeist of being a Palestinian. I think it's also important that we have lost some credibility, I think, as Jews and the West in general, because we decry all forms of Palestinian resistance. We say we don't want violence, but we've deeply resisted BDS, which, if you like or not like its leadership or some of its statements, it is a non-violent protest movement. So I think that we've lost a lot of credibility because we haven't seen Palestinian resistance as an anti-oppression movement. We've seen it as a threat to our safety. And I think that's caused a lot of difficulty in how we talk about it.
So we hear a lot of Israelis and Israel advocates saying, we Israelis, you'll hear them say, or Israel advocates saying Israelis or we Jews just want to live in peace. And it's the Palestinians who want to kill us. And you can call it occupation, but the checkpoints are there because there's terrorists and because they're going to want to come in. I know you don't like the word, but because they're going to want to come in and blow up our pizza parlors and our cities, and they have done that in the past, and that's why it's there. It's not pretty, but it's there for security. So what do you say to that? And so now I'm sort of shifting a little bit to the kinds of ideas I hear circulating out there. So, okay, let me preface it with one more thing. It's not just what do you say to that, because we're not just here to do a little point and counterpoint. What do you say to that in the spirit of the kind of dialogue you're trying to promote in the book? In the spirit of the kind of dialogue you're trying to promote in the book, what do you say when you hear that? And I'm sure you hear it often, because I certainly do. Jeff.
When we hear what exactly? That, that the checkpoints are there for.
Yeah, so you said that Palestinians are resisting occupation, which I happen to agree with, but many Israel advocates will say, well, occupation is simply a function of the West Bank, of there not being a peace agreement yet, because Palestinians don't want peace, and so the military is there because what else are they going to do with that territory? And they're there to make sure that the Palestinians don't come and harm peace-loving citizens who are just trying to go about their lives. So what do you think about the spirit of the book?
Any narrative that aims to demonize the other, I think I would immediately take out of the take it out of the equation. I think it's not productive. It's not constructive. When you say things like Palestinians don't want peace, seriously, Palestinians are enjoying the occupation they've been under for 57 years. So people, what do I say to someone like that? I ask them to question themselves, the things that they are saying to me. How have they come to know them? You hear often, well, there would have been peace and the Palestinians would have had their state if the Arabs had accepted the partition plan in 1948. Well, how do you know that? How do we know that there wouldn't have been war 5 minutes later? We don't know, but these are the kinds of tropes and propaganda that get put out there that provide, cover for people to feel better about themselves. I mean, to this day, Israel and most Jews have not come to terms with the Nakba. And it's they blame the victim and how they accepted the peace. Well, why weren't my parents allowed to go back to Palestine? After the war ended. So, we talk quite a bit in the book about the role that propaganda plays and how it creates and our wounds and takes the trauma that we are already in and uses it to demonize the other and keep people in their tribes. This is I think the common fight both of our communities should be engaged in against people in their own communities who do that.
Absolutely. Can I just add something, Mira? Raja actually, has said this many, many times. A Jewish person says, "I'm afraid." They're telling you the truth. They're not lying to you. Their fear, our community fear, our collective past, historical, and present, and fear of future trauma is real. We see trauma in a sense as a prologue. So the past has happened. It's an introduction to the horror that will happen next. So I think the central part of our work is to acknowledge and appreciate how someone feels and not expect them to simply turn a switch and not feel it. What we can do is say, this fear and pain you feel as a Jew, for example, are you able to imagine that a Palestinian feels a similar fear? Can you imagine that your fear for your children, that they share? And that right now, Palestinian in Gaza feels that fear much more intimately and much more immediately. It's about building empathy and compassion. I think the biggest concern that we have had, your question was kind of about how have we responded since October 7th. There's lots and lots of pain about what's happening over there that we talk about with each other every day. It's almost unbearable. I don't think there's a night that goes by that many of us sleep through. Yet the true focus of our work and our pain is the violent speech, and approach that we've had to each other here. That any word that isn't purely taken as you're for this or you're for that is immediately demonized. The amount of fear that leadership in my community has engendered in us by literally focusing on every single word of Palestinian resistance or protest as an immediate threat to our very existence. I mean, we have had close friends say that they're not sending their kids to school or they're not sleeping in their beds. I mean, this fear is so dominant. And is there a rise in real old school anti-Semitism, as there always is when violence, when war, when horrors happen over there? There always is. And we need to call it out. And most of what we are experiencing is anger at the injustice of it. And we, as Canadians, as American Canadians, as people who live here, should be able to tolerate one's anger.
So, is there a role for tribalism? Is there a role for loyalty to one's kith and kin? And does your answer depend on how you see your group's power relative to the other? So I wonder if Jeff would answer the same way Raja would to that.
Well, I mean, this is a cheap question. You and I have talked about this, many times. No is my simple answer. Tribalism, from a psychosocial perspective, locks you into fear, prevents you from seeing a broader picture, and almost ensures that your life will stay the same width that it currently is. So I don't feel a need to be loyal, in the way that I'm expected to. My loyalty to Jews is to help us out of victimhood. to empower us to live up to our values, to make things like Passover real, because we were slaves and now we are free. Our duty is to spread freedom everywhere. So yes, I feel loyal to very much loyal to my tribe in that way, but not in, easily acquiescing to the mainstream narrative about Israel.
How about you, Raja? Do you feel loyal to your tribe?
I'm local to the Palestinian cause. I'm loyal to my values. My tribe doesn't want me talking to Zionists. So I've already, uh, left the tribal camp in that sense. But I stayed true to the Palestinian cause, and talking to Jews all the last 17 years, I did not give up one right that I believed in, that the Palestinians should have. It doesn't mean that you're selling out on the cause if you talk to people, and this is something that I'm critical to, about towards my tribe about, because they've got this wall of, no, we don't talk to Zionists. And I'm not sure who you would talk to if you're not talking to Zionists. I mean, you can talk to the Kurds or the Armenians, but that's not our problem. Is not with them. Our problem is, as Palestinians, is with the Zionists. So yeah, I mean, I agree with Jeff that way. The loyalty to the tribe can be blinding. It can prevent you from using your own brain, thinking on your own, practicing your own values, and apparently that's something that doesn't come naturally to everyone.
I'm going to ask you a sensitive question, and I'm going to pretend we're alone here because it's something that has been on my mind for a while. So just audience, just don't listen for a minute. Sometimes Israel advocates share videos that are circulated, and they're put out by some right-wing pseudo universities. You might know what I mean. It's not really a university, it's just called that. It starts with a U. I mean, it just ends with a U. And it's a Palestinian. There's not even always the same one. There might be various Palestinians, single person being interviewed, very high production values, and they're talking about how great life is for them under Israeli rule. Let's say Palestinian citizen of Israel in this case, maybe someone even in the West Bank. And an Israel advocate will share this on social media, and they'll say, look, and they'll say, Sucharov, me talking to me, don't deny this Palestinian voice. Who are you to say that this Palestinian isn't speaking their truth? So what is a good way to help us navigate through, I mean, if I say the tokenization or utilization or exploitation, I'm already tipping my hand or tipping my hand. So how can you help us think this through that's not without me asking it in a tendentious way? Maybe Raja, because
there are Palestinians of all stripes and kinds, and some people might be happy as citizens of Israel. They're doing well. They have probably certain privileges, but I mean, to me, that doesn't mean anything, because I mean, we know that in Israeli law, by law, there are Jewish citizens and there are non-Jewish citizens, and they are not treated the same by the state and its institutions. And so, people can be happy under that, kind of situation, governance, whatever. But it doesn't mean anything. To me, it doesn't mean anything.
And I'm the only thing I'll add. I mean, there is over the last 2-3 years, there's been some movement here in the southern United States to teach and suggest that slavery was beneficial to Blacks. I see these as very kinny. I see these, as similar ideas, that the oppressor is relieving themselves of the pain they're causing by saying, "See, I helped this person."
Mhm.
I think it's deeply disingenuous, and I don't think it has much credibility.
And similar discourses have occurred in Canada by elected officials regarding residential schools.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that
Yeah, it's very.
same situation that, they did good.
Yeah.
Ange, I'd like to ask you to toss a question our way if you're ready or when you're ready.
Sure. Yeah. The first question is from an attendee, Nancy. Nancy asks, why can't the Palestinian leadership accept to become Palestinians within the state of Israel with representation in the Knesset and live in peace?
So is that in reference to one democratic state with equal rights for everyone? Is that why you understand that, Mira?
Yeah, I think it's a little confusing. So let me just give a little maybe I'll just give a quick breakdown for the audience. So there are three groups of Palestinians between the river and the sea. There's the 2.2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. We're hearing a lot about them right now in the news, obviously. There are Palestinians living in the West Bank under occupation. And then there are under Israeli military occupation, except that some of them also the ones who live in the concentrated Palestinian population centers like Ramallah and Bethlehem are under partial Palestinian Authority rule regarding civic matters and policing. But to get from place to place within the West Bank, you need to go through Israeli military checkpoints, and Israeli military can and does go into Palestinian population centers at will, can arrest people, can pull them out of their beds at night, can take them into military courts, and can put them into Israeli military prisons. Then there are Palestinian citizens of Israel. 1/5 of the Israeli population are citizens of Palestinian descent, and they officially have equal rights, but in practice there is a great deal of discrimination, as Raja was saying. So I'm not sure which group Nancy might be saying, why can't everyone just live together in one state? That would mean new territorial arrangements, but why don't you just take a stab, either of you, at some aspect of looking at what Palestinians want. Okay, let's put it this way. What do Palestinians want that they don't have right now? That's one way of putting it.
Well, I mean, the two-state solution, when it was still feasible, when the Oslo Accords took place in the early 90s, was broadly supported by Palestinians because it would have, ended their occupation. They would be citizens in a free country, and they don't have to answer to a foreign power. But then, the peace process faltered. Rabin was assassinated. Camp David and this and that happened and didn't get anywhere. And then there was the second Intifada, and of course, during all of this time, the settlements were still growing in the West Bank, illegal in international law. So it's hard for Palestinians now to say with genuine belief that they support a two-state solution because they don't see it as feasible anymore. So if that's out of the picture, so what are the other possibilities? Of course, there's the current one-state reality, which is, according to human rights groups, is an apartheid state. or a one state with equal rights for all, which would require Zionists to relinquish the belief that there should be a Jewish majority state that they can feel safe in. We've seen, Peter Beinart switch to that point of view in recent years. And I think that scenario would be the most just solution. I don't see it happening tomorrow. It might take decades for something like that to happen. And of course, there's your model that talks about, two citizenships, but the land being, basically accessible to everyone, which to me also strikes sort of the right balance. But that, I mean, right now it's hard to see, an Israeli public that has shifted to the right so much. And the current government that, everybody knows is like extreme right wing with fascist elements in it. Where do we go from here? If the United States is not able to force Israel to bring in food and humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza, do we think the United States is able to put sufficient pressure on Israel to, make the concessions that it needs to make for there to be two states? I'm doubtful. I'm very doubtful, but we shall see.
Thanks. Did you have anything to add, Jeff?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is, it's always hard to be able to interpret what someone means. So I don't want to layer something on Nancy's question that wasn't there. But what I think I heard in it was, what's wrong with the Palestinian leadership? Like, why aren't they doing a better job? And I'll share that I think from our perspective, I think it's easy to find fault with Palestinian leadership. I think most Palestinians find deep fault with Palestinian leadership. But I don't think it's helpful for us here to focus our energy on the failures of Palestinian leadership, because it's actually, we here, Jews and other citizens of Canada and the US, that have the ability to influence our governments to change policies that would put pressure on Israel to stop the occupation, the expansion of settlements. And I think that will be a much better use of our energies than something we can't control, like the ineptness of, or corruptness of Mahmoud Abbas and others. I just think it's much more helpful and constructive for us to focus on what we can do.
On that note, do we have any reactions? And I can read it out if we need a refresher on the parliamentary motion that was passed yesterday. Any hot takes, as they say?
Well, in the end, it was a compromise where certain demands were dropped or watered down. It remains significant in at least one way, and that is the no transfer of arms to Israel for the foreseeable future. There's no end date on that. And I think that's a meaningful step, because the arms going to Israel are being used in Gaza right now. So, when Biden on the one hand was saying, we want Netanyahu to kill less people, but continuing to provide ammunition to the Israeli army that's killing people, I mean, that's such a deceptive approach. So it's a meaningful step that Israel is not sending arms to Israel. Canada is not sending arms to Israel, even though I don't think we send a whole lot of them, but it's symbolically important.
And the only thing I'll say, why we're here tonight about free expression, is that you're very likely, if you haven't already heard, you're very likely to hear claims of the Canadian government being anti-Semitic because of its lack of support for Israel. And anyone has the right to say that. I just think it would be really important to reflect that making a policy decision about a foreign government and foreign policy is not, is not necessarily or even highly unlikely to actually be related to a tribe or a group or an ethnicity. We've been so taught to think that a reaction about Israel is a reaction against Jews. I just would really encourage us to temper that.
Thank you. And let's take another question from the audience.
Yeah, the next question is from Perla. Perla asks, Raja, could you have written this book with a Zionist rather than just a Jew?
Just a Jew. I'm going to take offense at that.
Like I said, I've been in conversation with Zionists for the last, 17 years. A very close friend of mine, Karen Mock, is very well known in the Jewish community. She's a progressive Zionist, at least that's what she, calls herself. We do have disagreements, but we've done a lot of things together. We've done workshops together. Could I have, it's a hypothetical, and frankly, I don't know if I could have written this book. It would have been probably a different book, because this book, is really a humanistic book. It looks about why do we behave and react the way that we do. And Jeff here, whose nickname is Dr. Trauma, brings this very important angle of trauma and how it influences us, that I knew nothing about before I met him. I learned so much about it from him. And this trauma angle, it brings in the humanity in us. So it's not about political opinion here. It's about, what emotions are motivating your actions and your reactions and so on. So I can probably write a book, and I think, Mira, you were alluding earlier to, a book being an argument and counter argument kind of book. Certainly, yes.
Great. Ange, another question?
Yeah, the next one is from Ahmed. On the subject of power between Arab and Jewish Canadians, what do you think is the best way forward? Is it by encouraging young Arab Canadians to be more active in politics and parties? Is it by educating the Canadian public in general about the Middle East in a more balanced way, just like how it is happening now with Indigenous history in schools and from elementary to high school?
The answer is yes to both questions. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an either or. I think both of those are absolutely significant and essential step forwards. I don't know if even the general Canadian sitting in their living room has even questioned how little we know about the Palestinian story. I mean, we very recently gave a workshop to EDI facilitators. They're experts in equity. And I think there were about 12 of them. 2 of them had heard of the Nakba. We just don't know. So I think the starting point is to humble ourselves and to ask about what we don't know. What we run into far too often is people have an opinion, but don't actually have any knowledge. And that makes it really tough. So I think the first thing we always do, even when someone says something, we say, how did you know that? Why do you think that? Where did you hear that from? Because we're trying to have integrity in our knowledge, trying to have integrity in how we think. I think that we, well, all of us, but maybe you and I on this call, Mira, have a particular duty to call out the pseudo knowledge that we see in academia, the moralizing moralizing and pontificating without necessarily questioning or inquiring or probing students to challenge their beliefs without telling them what to believe. And I think that's something as academics we really need to call out.
The Jewish community in Canada has had to build strong institutions. I mean, the Canadian Jewish Congress dates back to the early 1900s, a time when Jews in Canada faced very serious discrimination, and anti-Semitism was rampant. Jews there were quotas on Jews to join universities, and access to hospitals was restricted. That's why there's a Mount Sinai hospital. That's why there's a York University. So the Jews had to build strong institutions to fight for their rights, to counter anti-Semitism, and to provide services to its community that they couldn't get from somewhere else. And they have been around a long time. The sort of Arab/Palestinian communities are much younger in age in Canada. I mean, that the large immigration from the Middle East did not start until the 70s, and that's when the big numbers started coming in. And these communities are beginning to build their own institutions and finding their political voice as Canadians. The younger generation who were born here or who grew up here have the confidence of Canadian citizenship that probably their immigrant parents did not have. So the power imbalance is slowly changing, and I think that's a scary notion to some Jews, and certainly Jewish organizations that have historically gotten their way and controlled the narrative, and now it's harder to do that. Are worried about their ability to protect the community as like they used to. And I asked someone once, about CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and their actions and what they do, and that they can be bullying in their efforts, and certainly they do a fair amount of demonizing the other. And that person said to me, well, yeah, they do that, but we need strong institutions to protect us. This fear in the Jewish community is real, as Jeff said, and that's one of the first things I learned in talking to Jews, that the fear is real. Now, it does get manipulated, it does get stoked by the likes of CIJA for their own benefit, but the fear is real, and we as Palestinians need to understand that. The same way that the Jewish community needs to understand that our support for Palestine is not anti-Semitic. It's not because we hate Jews. It's just that we want our brothers and sisters over there to have freedom and equal rights that we have here as citizens of this country.
Jeff, anything to add?
No,
That was perfect, Jeff. That was perfect. You don't need to add anything.
It was perfect. And the only thing I'll say, it's not even adding, is this is what deep listening and learning does. Raja, I guarantee, would tell you that he didn't know a single word of what he just said until he started talking to Jews. And this is the real life. I'm sitting there watching it, and it's my Palestinian colleague who is telling your audience about the Canadian Jewish experience, not the Jewish guy. And I just think that's profound.
And you do a wonderful job talking about the Palestinian experience, Jeff. I should say that for the record.
Only because you've taught me.
Ange, another question.
Yeah, the next question is from John. And John says, it seems there might be peace if everyone was like Raja and Jeffrey. To what extent do you think the problem is between people like yourselves and extremists rather than between Jews and Palestinians?
That's a very thoughtful question.
Yeah.
Do you want to start, Raja?
Once I was just before COVID, the JSpace Canada had a conference. There were about 300 to 400 people there. I was invited to speak, which I did, and I attended, a part of the conference. And while we were sitting in there having conversation, and someone walked in. It turns out later we found out he's from the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, and started yelling at the Jews and the audience and telling them, calling them capos. Capos. Was a term. I'm telling you, a term used against Jewish collaborators with the Nazis back then. So, and it was interesting to see that, and that was the one when I realized that I had more in common with the people in that room than they had in common with this JDL fellow that walked in there. Certainly, the extremists can take us nowhere useful, constructive. Hamas, its ideology cannot take us somewhere useful and constructive. The ministers in the Israeli government who are racist and fascist are not going to take us anywhere good and constructive. I recognize Hamas as a Palestinian resistant movement. It is violent. It fights. It believes in the use of arms as a means of resistance. That doesn't disqualify it as a resistance movement, but certainly when they commit war crimes, I would call them on it. I think their methods are not compatible with my values. But right now we have extremist government in Israel, we have extremist government in Gaza, and we have a insignificant Palestinian Authority that is ineffective and corrupt in Ramallah, and none of these leaderships are going to take us anywhere positive, constructive.
Mira, I can't swear to this, but I'm relatively confident that we might never use the word peace once in our book. I really think the West's sort of fixation on a peace process is wasted energy and maybe even destructive. That what we need to do is face the reality that no matter how attached you might feel to Zionism or to Israel, that what it cost Palestinians is not only unacceptable, but not sustainable. We, for a long time, have been talking about the process of resolution and change being much more akin to truth and reconciliation than to peace. I'm relatively certain you feel similarly, but feel free to disagree if you don't. I just really think that we keep getting sent off on tangents that don't get us anywhere. I found it really remarkable, the uptick in conversations about a Palestinian state. I mean, even it came right to the Canadian government, to the House of Parliament, to adopt the idea of a Palestinian state. What makes us think that a Palestinian state is more possible now than it was 6 months ago, after 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, bombed, many would say murdered? What somehow Oslo, probably something around 100,000 settlers, now over 700,000 settlers. What makes us think that now is a time to generate. It just seems like we're trying to assuage our guilt, our pain, and instead we need to talk about justice. And I mean that for everyone, for Jews, for Palestinians, for all. We know that many Jews in Israel, Palestine, do not live equal lives with other Jews. And I think if we're going to talk about justice, we need to talk about justice for everybody.
I've started talking about peace and justice together, and just then it's sort of something for everyone, kind of like a twist cone, which is my favorite flavor of a soft serve cone, because there is a synergy to it, and I find that useful. Another question, Ange?
Yeah, the next question is from Valerie. Valerie asks, are protests in Canada advantageous to either Palestinian or Israeli groups, or do they create a heightened sense of tensions between the groups?
Well, I mean, the protests are the instrument of the weak. People who do not have access to the corridors of power go to the street to express their political position. Now, I have never seen a Hamas flag in any pro-Palestinian rally. There might have been that I haven't seen, but all I've seen are Palestinian flags. Yet these rallies have been called by some people pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, including the Premier of Ontario, which is demeaning, insulting, and doesn't take into account the humanity of the people in Gaza and the humanity of the Palestinians here who are worried about them or concerned for them, with good reason. They're being slaughtered every day. So when you go out on the streets and demonstrate peacefully, it's a democratic right. It seems to be that some protests are okay with us, other protests are not, and that's not a fair societal kind of approach. So people are angry, people are afraid, frustrated. These protests are not meant to be threatening to Jews, even though I can understand that for some Jews they can be. They're not against Jews. They're not anti-Semitic. They are for Palestinian rights, and I have absolutely, all kinds of people are. By the way, I've been out on these protests. There's a lot of majority of non-Palestinian folks actually. There's a lot of white Canadian families with children were walking in these protests. So no, I think that's a very legitimate form of expression.
How do we navigate the accusations that some of these Palestine solidarity protests are attempting to target Jewish businesses, or you mentioned Mount Sinai Hospital? There was accusations that there was a protest in front of the hospital and that the Spider-Man guy, was climbing the hospital, and that made Jews feel unsafe, that their places that have Jewish legacies and heritage are being targeted. I know that there's another version of that story as to why they were in front of the hospital, but what's the best way for us who are trying to reach across the divide and trying to have dialogue and justice and peace and all the good things to do with these kinds of situations?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason the Spider-Man called the Spider-Man. He climbs buildings. He climbed a lot of buildings on that street. And people jumped to the conclusion that Mount Sinai was being targeted because it's Jewish and these are Palestinians, therefore it's a bad situation and they're there to threaten Jews. I've spoken with people who were there and they said, this is nonsense. We were walking through that street, which stopped in front of a number of buildings. Spider-Man did what he does. you know, in hindsight, should Spider-Man avoided a Jewish institution? I'd say yeah, because you know, but you know, I'm not even sure that he knew it was a Jewish institution. So let's turn down the temperature, folks. Let's not make assumptions about people's motives based on who they are.
Something we've been saying really for a long time, long before recent events, is that I think it's incumbent on our community, on the Jewish community, to be able to recognize that we are expecting Palestinians to separate Zionism from Judaism when we ourselves really can't. You know, so I think that's a really challenge for us that we really need to think about. The other part is to pay more attention to what is being protested than to the fact that there are protesters. I think we are diverting our attention from what people are upset about. And we are instead focusing on how they're displaying their upset. No, I think that there is very reasonable discourse to be had about, for example, protesting outside of a cafe because it's owned by an Israeli company. I don't think either Raj or I feel that that is right. But do we demonize the people for doing it? No. Do we assume that they're doing it because they hate Jews? No. But do we think that it is fair to say that we should make more separation between somebody's private space and your assumptions about their political ideology? Yes, I certainly do. I'm more worried about the way these protests are being manipulated to again silence Palestinian voices. I think that we should all be offended by that. You know, here talking in the Center of Free Expression, quelling speech by creating an unreasonable fear about what that speech is doing, I think is wrong.
And when there were protesters in front of the Indigo, it wasn't because it was Jewish owned. It was because Heather Reisman runs an organization that recruits people for the Israeli army from around the world and funds it. I mean, that's a legitimate stand to take there when Israeli soldiers, probably some of them recruited by Reisman, are, you know, killing Palestinians by the hundreds every day. So,
or the protest outside of a synagogue where they were selling real estate in the West Bank.
yeah.
I think we need to be a lot more nuanced in how we talk about these things.
Another question, Ange? Maybe time for one or two more?
Okay, the next question is from Mary, and Mary says, my cousins in Israel categorically hate all Arabs. I want to move past biting my tongue. Do you have any suggestions?
I want to what? Sorry.
I want to move past biting my tongue.
Oh,
Do we
So
have any suggestions?
advice for someone who's trying to engage her cousins in anti-racist awareness.
you know, I will let Jeff respond more directly, but I want to say that I was amazed at the number of stories I heard from Jewish people here in the city about difficulties they were having with their parents, with their families, with friends who are now lost. They no longer are friends because of the different positions that they're taking with respect to, you know, Gaza and you know, October 7th. That's astounding. That's really astounding. And you know, I know it's hard to go against the tribe. I've done it, but I mean, not everyone can. But the extent to which emotions are so high that people are staying away from friends and family because of them is just outstanding. And I hope there will be some constructive conversations at some point when the emotions have subsided that people can appreciate these differences and where do they come from.
For the person I think the first thing we can always, if we only could really, I know it's a boring answer, but we can only work on ourselves. So the first thing I would say to them is, to yourself, please understand that your family's response that comes out as hate is repressed fear. And therefore you can have empathy for someone who's afraid, whether that fear is rational or not. Both Israelis and Palestinians have learned to be fearful and hateful of the other. This is a process that's taken a long time to form and will take a long time to undo. Anytime any of us find ourselves, I hate or I feel about them, we are dehumanizing a group. We are saying that group is one thing. So I think empathy comes from understanding that groups are never one thing, and that certainly you may decide at some point to say to your family members that it doesn't matter who you're saying it about, what you're saying is hateful. And it hurts me as someone who loves you to hear you speak hatefully about anyone. Take Arabs and Palestinians out of it and talk about humanity. Talk about, it hurts me to hear you hate.
Thank you. 2 more questions I think we have time for. Maybe Ange, you want to say both the questions, and then we can answer them in a little pair. Pick 2 more good ones.
Okay. I can do it separately. That might be easier to remember the second question when you're ready for it. Is that all right? Or it's okay. So the first question is from an attendee. They ask, they say, I work at the university, and every time there is a pro-Palestinian action on campus, Jewish students write to say they feel threatened. I also observe that Jewish communities have a lot of power in our community. How do we respond if the deep listening and learning isn't part of the goals of these community members? And it's okay to come back to me, Mira, just because I know the next one, I think it'll erase it from everybody's mind.
Well, we've already touched a little bit on it, right? This is fear. It's easy for us to say that it's irrational, but it doesn't matter. Fear is fear, worry is worry. Hearing stories and narratives outside of our own can feel deeply threatening. Our brain is actually taught to resist many new things because it is a threat to our surety of what is right and wrong. So to have mercy with it. And secondly, it is incumbent on universities and other institutions to protect free speech, to create spaces where people can share how things are painful, but not to demonize them as anti-Semitic or necessarily hateful, but to talk on a human level. When you said this, I felt hurt. This is where change happens, not trying to silence people for saying something that you don't happen to like.
Universities have done a miserable job at helping Jews and Palestinians or supporters of either side to have conversations, to have dialogue, to try to understand each other. Jeff mentioned BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. Jews have been told by their institutions, their mainstream institutions, that BDS is anti-Semitic. I've never seen a shred of evidence of BDS being anti-Semitic, but this is what they tell folks. And Jewish student goes to university, sees a desk with a BDS sign on it. Of course, they're going to be afraid because they've been told that BDS is anti-Semitic, and therefore people who support BDS are anti-Semitic. So, but we have to question, why is that so? Why are people being told to be afraid things that are not really threatening to them?
Ange, one last question.
Okay, the last one is from Ivor. And Ivor says, I presume you both have relatives and former friends who think of Jeffrey as a traitor to fellow Jews and Raja a traitor to fellow Palestinians. Is that happening? And if so, how do you deal with this without it driving you to excess rage?
Just a little rage, not too much rage.
Little Ray.
Actually, I was sorry.
Well, you go ahead, buddy.
I was told the other day that someone, a Palestinian woman, actually described me as a Zionist, which of course I laughed. Look, I know who I am, and my record speaks for itself. I've been involved in my community for a very long time, and I've fought for Palestinian rights for a very long time. So I don't listen to people to things like that because I know they're not true. I think it's harder for Jeff.
I think that's fair. I think there are two reasons. I mean, we're humans first, right? I am thinner skinned than Raja. Raja has a very good round back that water rolls off of. I never have, and I'll confess that to this group of strangers. The second thing is that people that I don't know hurts a little, but it's okay. People who I know personally, I've worked with over an extensive period of time, who have, said some of these things, traitor, capo, self-hating Jew, I could never speak with you again after the statements you made. That stings. I'm not going to lie. But I do come around relatively quickly to empathizing that this is pain that's leaking out in a hurtful way. That hurt begets more hurt. I think the overarching thing I want to really leave your audience with, which is the message of our book, is that misery has no hierarchy. Pain is pain, suffering is suffering. And I think we keep trying to position it. Whose pain is greater? The great Edward Said said that Palestinians are the victims of victims and refugees of refugees. I think that if we view it that way, we are much more likely to show each other a compassion and empathy.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn it back to Jim to close us out.
Well, thank you, Mira, for
Thank you, Mira, as always.
Conversation. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And I want to thank the three of you. I mean, the last question, your answer to that is a good way to end this discussion, which could go on for a very long time. We've done many of these programs over the last 9 years. I don't think I've found one as engaging and riveting as this one. So I want to thank the three of you for sharing so openly and honestly your thoughts and views on these very difficult matters that are almost impossible to discuss in most situations. That's one of the problems. So you're not only the content of what you said, but you're a model for what we need if we're going to ever be able to move forward. So thank you very much. I want to say to the audience, thank you for joining us. A video of today's or this evening's conversations can be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow. So if you found it worthwhile and want to recommend it to others, I'd encourage you to do so. Send them the link to it. The CFE website is cfe.torontomu.ca. We're also going to be posting, along with the video, some resources that our participants have suggested if you want to read more about this, the issues that they've talked about that you might find interesting. There was one question about saying, where can I get this book? Because it's out of print everywhere. And I think the problem is because of its popularity. Jeff Raja told me it's in the third printing now, or maybe fourth printing. So it will be in the bookstore shortly. So I'd encourage you to go to your favorite bookstore, preferably an independent one, and order it, because it will be, the publisher, I'm sure, is working hard to get out more copies. So I'd encourage all of you to do that.
Jim, we have a few copies left. If people are eager and they can't wait, they can go to thewallbetween.org and they can order a copy there.
Wonderful. So you have an inside track of getting a copy, and it is
Well-
worth reading, I can assure you.
Yeah, there's some small privileges for being authors, not many.
Yes. If you want more information about upcoming programs that the CFE has had, as well as the videos for all the ones we've had in the past, again, go to our website, cfe.torontomu.ca. Thank you all so much for joining us. And again, thanks to the three of you for a really engaging conversation. Good night.
Thank you for having us. Good night.
Good night, everyone.